Hi, my name is Nate Prodzik, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I've been playing Magic for over 20 years now, since about 1994, although not seriously back then. And one of my best friends is one of the greatest Magic designers of all time in terms of his impact on the foundations of the game, Brian Weissman. Privileged to have him as a playtest partner. He's actually the one who got me into Commander in about 2009, and which we at the time we were playing 100 card singleton online, but we moved into Commander as that format became. There was a question about which format, that one or the Commander format, was going to be the more popular one. Eventually, it shook out that Commander was the more popular format in general. So for the sake of finding opponents, and for a few other reasons, we transitioned to the Commander format and been having fun with that, and have stuck with that pretty much ever since. So the reason I'm making this video is a little different than some of my others. I've got many videos if you are interested in checking out games, gameplay, and a lot of my videos go into decisions during games, or in the case of drafts, I've got a few of those decisions I make then. But something I don't think I've done yet is just the deck building decision making. I've talked about individual card choices or why I've made changes or cuts, but I don't think I've ever really talked about my overall philosophy for the format. And I thought, because I've had a number of conversations about this, that I would just give you an opportunity to hear my thoughts on the matter, and hopefully give myself an opportunity to hear your thoughts on the matter, because with any luck, it's a two-way conversation. I can learn something from you, my viewers, as well, and we'll have a bit of fun too while we do this, hopefully. So there's going to be a lot more talking in this one than usual, and I will apologize in advance. I'm getting over being a little bit sick, so I'm cheeking a cough drop here, so I hope that's not too distracting to you. Anyway, the deck that I'm going to start out with, using as an example, is Alaro. And the reason I'm using my Alaro deck, and I'll just scroll right so you can see all the cards. And I'm going to scroll down so you can see all the lines. And I'll point out the one change from my last video. I pulled Exclude and put Mental Misstep back in. Exclude protects me from things that have less impact, and Mental Misstep protects me from things that have greater impact, like another Soul Ring, and Thought Seizes and Duresses and stuff when I keep sketching hands. So for that reason, I have made the switch. And now let's talk about, and the reason for using Alaro as my example deck list here is just that it's what I have together, but also because I can talk about some of the exceptions when you're playing a deck with a heavy feature base, but in general, this has enough of what it uses enough of what I think is important to kind of go through the format. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through kind of section, like type by type, lands, artifacts, and then we'll go through the different colors. I'm also going to touch base on green and red. If I could play those cards, if I could play green and red, if they got rid of the commander color restriction, what cards would I be compelled to play? Which ones would I say, okay, I am playing green, I will play these cards. Or I'm playing red, these cards are making it in my deck. And if they are not making it in my deck, I have a doggone good reason for why. I have a very specific reason. I've thought it through, and I realized that even then I could be wrong. So I kind of want to do that. I'm gonna not just do it for green and red, though. I'm gonna do it for all the colors. So this video is my attempt to tell you what I think you ought to consider as your baseline for each color combination, land combination, artifact combination, as for what you ought to feel compelled to play these cards. And if you aren't playing with them, you have a pretty good reason. And after we talk, hopefully that reason is based on some of the information that I've given you, and your own intuition and experience as well. Now, before I go into it, the last thing I'll say is that I realize that not everybody plays Commander to optimize their deck, in the sense that they're not trying to win a game as quickly as they can. And when you're not playing Cutthroat like that, some of this may not apply to you, but I'd like to point out that, excuse me, I'd like to point out that for those who are, even the ones that are playing, like, your goal in Commander might be to, Johnny goal, to put together some quirky combo that does something crazy if you can actually get it all together. 3-card combo that makes elephants or something. Maybe you're playing. Excuse me. Hopefully this cough drop helps me. If you're playing a Timmy deck and your goal is to cast big dragons or make an army of soldiers or something, that's totally fine. These principles may actually help, or these card ideas may actually help you do exactly what you're trying to do with your deck. Because I'm not suggesting cards because they destroy your opponent necessarily. I'm suggesting most of these cards because they power your deck up. So whatever it is you want to do, Johnny, Timmy, or Spike, or some combination of those, cards that power your deck up will help you do those things more consistently, or more quickly, and more resiliently in the face of whatever it is your opponent's doing to disrupt you. So let's move into it. The first thing, excuse me, that I'm going to do is talk about artifacts. And then I'm going to go to lands. I'm actually going to skip lands right off the bat. And there's a reason for this, and I'll show you what that reason is. So the reason, so I can get some of this menthol working here. So the reason that I'm skipping lands right now is because there are artifacts that are much, much better than lands. And those artifacts primarily are the 4 on the left here. It's kind of weird to say a vault or a monolith is better than lands, but kind of explain why with math. And really, when it comes right down to it, the game was made by Richard Garfield, the mathematician, and my nickname for the game is Mathemagic, because frequently, and you see this most with blue-based decks, you can win with mathematical victories. Like, you have 5 cards in hand. I have 5 cards in hand that say counter target spell, and I have a 5-turn clock. You have no cards in hand. Mathematically, I've won because your next 5 relevant cards are countered, and then you're dead because I have a 5-turn clock, so game's over, even though I haven't actually dealt damage to you yet. So, in the world of Mathemagic, the most important thing that you can have is mana. Because if you don't have any mana, you don't get to play the rest of your cards. And if you don't get to play your cards, you've lost the game before it started, or at whatever point your mana gets pinched. So, what cards let you play your cards? Well, lands, yes, but artifacts in this format can do it even better. And the 2 best, by far, are Mana Crypt and Soul Ring. And their cousins, Vault and Monolith, temporarily can give you a similar boost. And this is the way it works. If you play a first-turn Mana Crypt in a land that produces 1 mana, let's assume, since you can only play 1 land drop per turn, that on any given turn, whichever turn that is, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, or whatever, you should have the corresponding amount of mana in play. You shouldn't be missing your land drops, so on turn 1 you should have 1 mana, 2 is 2, and so forth. So if that's the case, then on turn 1, if you play a Mana Crypt, you're going to have 3 mana versus what you should have, which is 1. That's a 300% increase in your mana base, which is monstrous. It's huge. And if you were to consider that kind of advantage in another arena, which is a focus of most control decks, which is the card advantage arena, for you to have a similar advantage on turn 1, you'd have to start with a 21 card hand. To have 3 times as many resources in mana, if you're comparable in card advantage, it would take 14 extra cards starting in your hand. You would have to have a pretty good, ancestral recall. 1 blue, draw, what is that, like 15 extra cards? Which I don't think they're going to be printing anytime soon. So, you can't do that kind of thing generally with card draw, but you can do it with mana, and you should as much as possible. And I think everybody knows this. If you look at most decks, well, basically 100% of all commander decks have a Soul Ring in them. Not everybody understands. Everybody understands why they have a soaring, but not everybody understands how critical it is to focus on why they have a soaring. And most have a crypt. I think people have started realizing that in a 40 life format, this card's actually better than Soul Ring. Not as many have Vault and Monolith, although I see them often enough. So why Vault and Monolith? Well, Crypt is 300% mana on turn 1. Soul Ring is double your mana on turn 1 because you have to pay 1 to get 2. And then 2 mana is twice as much as you should have. On turn 2, however, if you play a second land, you now have 4 mana with a Crypt or a Soul Ring, a first turn Soul Ring. So you'll have 4 times as much mana on turn 2. Well, what happens if you play a Vault on turn 1? Well, if you play Vault on turn 1, you can have 300% mana. You can have triple your mana if you want to burn it for the turn, just like if you had played a Mana Crypt. If you decide you don't, then on turn 2, you actually have 5 mana. You have more mana than if you had a Crypt or a Soul Ring draw, and these are the 2 best cards in the format. It's temporary, yes, but that kind of advantage can be a huge, very important, swingy thing. I mean, imagine if you're playing, imagine Standard where you went first turn Mana Vault, second turn Batter Skull or something. I mean, it's incredible, right? So anyway, or the recent modern Pro Tour. Imagine if they could have had access to this in the Eldrazi decks. For the same reason, if you were to wait though, and you waited till turn 3 to use your Vault, you would have 6 mana, which is still double. Mana Crypt and Soul Ring, a little bit weaker, you've got 5, but it's still a tremendous advantage. And if you went turn 2 Monolith, turn 3, you've got 6, so these two become roughly even on turn 3. The first 3 turns are where the critical development of the game is. So beyond that, you can look at a card like Basalt Monolith and say, well, that's just like a Grim Monolith. I'll bring it up so you can see what I'm talking about, for those who don't know. Basalt Monolith here is, I'll use a Z key. Oh, I hate the ugly old pictures. Where's the good? There we go. So Basalt Monolith is 3 mana, and then it ramps you by 3. And it only takes 3 to untap. Grim Monolith is 2 and ramps you by 3, but it takes 4 to untap. For 1 more mana, you basically get a Grim Monolith that's easier to untap and useful in certain combo decks, but we won't worry about combo right now. Anyway, so why am I not including Basalt in here? Well, it's because the key turns for development, like I said, are turns 1 through 3. After that, the value of developmental cards starts to change, starts to get a little weaker. For example, on turn 4, a turn 4 Crypt, it's still an amazing play, but you go from 4 to 6 mana, so it's a 50% increase. So contrast that to a 300%, a 200%, and so forth. Now you're at a 50% increase. Absolutely a play I would still make and love to make, but going down in power. And when you look at Basalt's inability to be played before turn 3, and it only has an effect on turn 4, generally, unless you're cheating it out with like Workshop or something, but in general, since it only starts affecting things on turn 4, which is when we've moved into what we value changes, we start valuing more permanent sources of mana, like Worn Power Stone more highly. Then Basalt just loses. It just doesn't quite have the same punch, so that's why it's not included here. So that kind of covers the first 4 artifacts, but they're very important because these are going to color our decisions with the rest of every other card that we select in the format. If it doesn't color your decision making, you're going to lose these cards too much, or you're not going to be able to capitalize on these cards often enough. So, speaking of capitalizing on them, nothing does that better than Winter Orb. Winter Orb is a card that, timed correctly, can just win you the game. So, if you are not playing Winter Orb, you are a Magic Master who's figured out a very, very good reason not to do it. Now, I know Brian, for example, does not play it in his Nin deck, or at least at one time he didn't. I think he still doesn't. But he is a master of the game, and he has very specific reasons. And even then, it's possible that his deck would be better if it had access to Winter Orb, even though he's got reasons that compel him not to use it. It's not 100% certain, even then, that it isn't a card that should be in a deck. It's just that good. Because when it's timed correctly, it crunches your opponent's mana base, but not yours, and that's huge. It's a huge advantage. It allows you to continue to play the game while they can't. Which is weird, because I'm suggesting everybody should be running these artifact mana sources, and then I'm suggesting everyone should be running Winter Orb, and if everybody's running artifact mana sources, then Winter Orb shouldn't be good in that environment. But, first off, not that many people listen to my videos, and not that many people are going to be running enough artifact mana sources, and not just artifact mana sources, but alternate mana sources. So against excuse me, against players like that, Winter Orb's like a free win for you. It's an easy win. Just slam it in there, drop it down at the right time, and you can win a game. Secondly, Winter Orb's one of the few cards in the format, there aren't that many, that can take a losing position and make it a winning position. I mean, you can be way behind. Like, imagine a green ramp deck that goes like first turn exploration, so they can play an extra land and play a bounce land. Turn 2, they replay another land. 2 lands, so they've got 4 mana. They cast Oracle of Moldiah. There's a land on top of the deck. They play a bounce land. Now they've got 5 mana. What are you going to do? You drop a Winter Orb. Perhaps not then, because they're going to have a bunch more mana in play. But maybe you remove the Oracle, and then a turn later they go for a big play. You counter it or whatever. You play Winter Orb. Now they're untapping these bounce lands that I've used in my example slowly, but it gives you a lot more time than if you were to just sit there and have no answer while they have like 7 or 8 mana in play every turn, hitting you with Haymaker after Haymaker crushing you. The same can be said using like Cultivate or any of the other ramp strategies that are employed by some green decks. Winter Orb is really important for dealing with that, but it also is really good against blue, which is the most powerful color in the format. It's really good against catching a blue mage at the wrong time. Blue mages love to play cards at the end of your turn, but with a Winter Orb in play, if they don't have alternate mana sources, they can play cards at the end of your turn, but then those lands don't untap. So it's as if they played a sorcery, which is huge and gives you a very powerful way to get back in a game when you're losing to a blue mage. And at 2 mana, it's something you can slip out against a blue mage with another bait spell to try to get them focused on something else. So when you're so that's pretty much why. And also, lastly, since you're going to be building your decks with the power of these artifacts in mind, you're also going to be building with solutions to these cards. So your solutions can chip away at your opponent's alternate mana sources, and then Winter Orb can be good against even the players that come prepared and are running Winter Orb themselves. Crucible of Worlds is a card that, in a format with Strip Mine, Wasteland, and Fetchlands, absolutely thrives. It's basically a Phyrexian Arena when you have a Fetchland. It only generates lands, but it gives you a guaranteed land drop, which is a big deal. And thins your deck, gives you a reusable shuffle effects if it's fetches. And in the case of Wasteland or Strip Mine, it's essentially it's a stone rain. It costs you a land, yes, but it costs you because you're missing your land drop in order to take away theirs. Excuse me. But with Crucible, you're guaranteed that once they run out of land drops, you won't. You'll hit your land drops because you're going to continue to play lands from your graveyard, plus the ones that you were holding in your hand and couldn't play while you were using those lands. And I think by now everybody understands how good Crucible Strip Mine can be, or bad if you're the other person. But I think it's basically like if they printed a 3-mana Phyrexian Arena that was an artifact, everybody would put it in their deck. Well, that's basically what Crucible of Worlds is with a Fetchland, even when you're not doing the Wasteland stuff. So I think it ought to go in every deck, personally, or you have a really good reason, again, not to run it. But whatever that reason is, I question whether it actually makes sense. Because of Crucible Strip, or Crucible Wasteland, and Winter Orb's ability to pinch mana, and because alternate mana sources are so good, it actually makes alternate mana sources even better and more important. Because the counter to somebody who's hitting you with If they've got you Crucible Strip locked, and you have no mana in play, and you just keep hitting your lands, and you draw Mana Crypt, you can start ramping back into the game and win a game with literally no lands in play. And I have a few videos where that's happened. My opponent was using either Crucible Strip or Life from the Loam and a Strip Mine or Wasteland, and sort of locked me out of the game at a point where anyone else would have, in general, would have conceded, I would say. I had no mana in play. And I was able to rebuild my mana base using artifacts and alternate mana, get back in the game that way, and eventually take over the game and win, just because I not only refused to give up, but I refused to give up knowing that there was a way I could still win. So that's why you should play these cards, and that's why you have to be aware of these cards. In addition to those, again, blue's the best color, and we'll kind of see why when I go into the colors. But given that blue's the best color, if you are playing blue, you should be playing Shackles and Metamorph as well. Metamorph is another way to get yourself a Soul Ring when you don't have one and they do. It's also, just super flexible and good. Shackles is just one of the most devastating cards for dealing with creatures. You can imagine a scenario where your opponent has 4 creatures, you have none. Use Shackles and take one of their guys. They attack with the other 3. You trade off. Now they have 2 to your 0. You take 1 and they can't even attack. By itself, Shackles for a small life total exchange. You've used Shackles to kill 4 creatures or nullify 4 creatures. It's insane. So if you're playing blue, you absolutely should be playing with these 2 cards as well. And now for the rest, I'm going to break these down into mana and mana, utility, and other. So first on the mana side, I'm really sorry about that. The thing with the mana is that if you're playing green and you're running alternate mana sources heavy in the green side, you still should be playing all these cards. If you're playing green, you should be playing all these cards. If you're playing green and blue, you should be playing all of these cards. And I'm talking green with like elves and alternate mana sources like that. But if you're not playing with all those extra alternate mana sources, and that's going to be most of us probably, then what you should be playing with are these cards. And the reason is, you want to play cards that either make more mana. First of all, the major impact of these cards here, mathematically, is on the first 3 turns. We talked about that. So the reason we don't play a Grim Monolith effect on turn 3 like Basalt is because it doesn't impact anything until turn 4, and then it's a little late. Well, a Soul Ring, on the other hand, a permanent source of extra mana advantage, in a card that produces at least 2 for 3 mana, or in Power Stone, is worthwhile to play. And because it's permanent, not temporary like Basalt. And then in Dynamo, which is a 4 mana drop, so it kind of goes beyond our turn 3 wall window, but this is a 3 mana with 1 card. Well worth it at 4, and it's mana that you can use right away. It's way too good. Way too good not to play. And then Gilded Lotus at 5 mana is the same 3, which is close to, like, if Gilded Lotus produced colorless mana, I don't know if I would play it or not. It's right on the fence. I know if it's 6 mana and it produces 3 colors, I won't play it. But if it's 5 mana and produces 3 colors, it's quite possible it's still playable. But 5 mana for 3 colored mana, that's incredible. And unless you're playing, like I said, unless you're playing with green mana sources, this belongs in everybody's deck, without a doubt. Because not only is it a really big ramp, but it's also color fixing as well, which is incredibly important. And then Coalition Relic can produce 2 mana. It does it. It does it every other turn. The turn you play it, you charge it in the next turn. So you go from 3 mana on turn 3 to 6 mana on turn 4, which is still a pretty respectable increase. Just as if you played a Worn Power Stone. And so, and although it can only do it every other turn, because it comes with color fixing as well, and the ability to fix 2 colors with 1 card on a single turn, that makes it worth playing, despite the fact that it's only every other turn that you're getting the free mana. So, and in a deck with blue, with counterspells, in a way, by using the charge mana and leaving it untapped, representing a counterspell, you are kind of getting to use the mana, both mana, every turn. You're using one to spend for like a brainstorm or a ponder or something, and then one to threaten them with a counterspell, which is still using the mana. And then if they say go and don't do anything, you just charge, and now you get 2 mana on the next turn, one to play and one to threat. So this card belongs. In addition to those 3 cards right there, another card that belongs is Chromatic Lantern. And the reason Chromatic Lantern belongs is because it too can produce 2 mana. You say, how can Chromatic Lantern produce 2 mana? Well, the reason it can produce 2 mana is because you're almost certainly going to be playing with some lands that don't always work, or don't always work correctly at the right time. And Chromatic Lantern fixes all that. It can take a land like the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, which has not necessarily a land I recommend, but I'm just saying, as an example, has no mana producing ability at all, and turn that land into a mana producing land. And it's a color fixer. So because it has the potential to produce additional mana, and it's a color fixer, it belongs in this pile of mandatory playables, I think, unless you are playing with green sources that do the job better or cheaper. So lastly, I've got over here, so now I'm going to talk about the cheap ones. Talismans and Signets. Talismans and Signets at 2 mana, so if you think about if we do the math again, to go from 2 mana on turn 2 to 4 mana on turn 3. Basically, if you imagine on turn 2 you play a Talisman and use it, you've spent 3 mana that turn, which is a 50% increase in your mana base, which is pretty significant. To go from 2 mana to 4, 2 mana on turn 2 to 4 mana on turn 3, is still a 1/3 increase over what you should have had, and it still doubles your mana compared to what you had on the previous turn. And 4 mana on turn 3 is still like respectable, and so for those reasons we're going to play Talismans, but also because we need to have enough artifacts, Talismans and Signets. We also need to have enough artifacts for Winter Orb to make sure that our orb is good for us. So that's why these cards make it. Now when you're picking which ones to use, if you're playing a blue-based deck, then the ones you use should be the ones that make blue. If your deck is, say, black base, and you splash whatever other colors, then the ones you pick should be the ones that make black. Whatever your dominant color is, that's what your talismans should be. If for some reason, I cannot remember if there are talismans in the enemy colors. I probably should know that. So let's check right now. That's red-black, red-green, that's blue-white, unity. Okay, no. So in the colors, if you're playing enemy, some kind of combination where you cannot use talismans because there aren't any in your colors, the signets are in all of them, I know that. You can replace these with another 2 mana artifact that will do the job similarly well, if you can find it. Like something like Felwar Stone, Mind Stone can be okay. You can even use, excuse me, you could even use Everflowing Chalice, for example, because at 2 mana it produces 1. You try to get colored mana when you can, and you want to minimize the amount of colorless mana producing artifacts that you're using that don't produce like gross amounts of mana like these others do. But sometimes those are your options. I'll also say, speaking of Felwar Stone, that if you're playing a 5-color deck, include Felwar Stone as a mandatory card. And I would strongly consider Mox Opal as well. In a 5-color deck, you need to have mana fixing, and those 2 cards can fix all of your color problems for your splash colors with a single card. They have that potential. So cards that have that kind of potential belong in a deck, a 5-color deck. They probably belong in a 4-color deck. At 3 colors, you could play them or not. You can take them or leave them. At 2 colors, put them in your deck. I'm talking Felwar and Opal in specific. At 2 colors, put them in your deck if you want to. Another example of a card like that is at 5 colors, you'd almost certainly be playing Mox Diamond for the exact same reasons. And at 1 color, you would actually be playing Chrome Mox, because it will always produce the color that you want, and it's just more ramp. It makes a lot of sense.
So having talked about the artifact ramp, let's look at the last few, which are utility cards. Um, One utility card that you're probably going to put in every commander deck is Sensei's Divining Top, because of the interaction that it has with fetch lands is just too powerful to ignore, as well as anything that lets you search your deck, of which you should have a number. It's least powerful in a mono-colored deck, so it's possible that you don't play it in a mono-colored deck. But I suspect that even then, because of you're going to have shuffle effects and stuff, if you get to a point where it looks like it's not useful for you, as soon as you draw a shuffle effect, just activate it for best effect. Take an extra card and shuffle that guy away. So you probably will still play it in a monocolored deck, but that's the one case where maybe not. But for everybody else, two colors and up top is a pretty mandatory card just for thinning your deck and giving you card selection. Scroll-Rack's another card that could be considered along the lines of top, but um, Scroll-Rack has certain colors that it is mandatory with. One specifically, and that color is white. Because if you're playing, and we'll get to that, it's partner in crime, and most of you probably already figured it out right now. The card I'm talking about is land tax, but there are other cards as well, like tithe. So we'll get that when we go to white. But so if you're playing white, then Scroll Rack does, I think, become essentially mandatory, provided you're playing the cards that I just mentioned. Um, and But if you're not, it's generally a very powerful effect. You can take a hand with 5 lands and you can turn it into a hand with 5 spells. It's card disadvantage because, if you draw it off the top with an empty hand, you play it and it does nothing. But in 1 or 2 turns, it will have double the number of cards you've seen, and that effect alone can make this card worthwhile. And so if you're not going to put it in your deck, you should have, again, very specific reasons for why you're not playing it. Two decks where you might not play it, for example, are Edric, because you should be drawing so many cards that spending a mana to see more cards becomes redundant, and Nin, and that's only because, and the other reason is that they're 2 colors, so you have less fetch lands in these cards. And in the Pain Artist will frequently just draw a big new hand, at which point you just don't need 2 new hands, 1 is enough, and so it's less effective in those decks, but you could play them in those colors just for the early development consistency. It's just that good of a card. Lastly, Expedition Map is a card that the more you want to put, Expedition Map is a card that you want to put in every deck. You may not be able to, but you want to. You'll try to, and the reason is that you are already putting Crucible of Worlds in every deck. You should be. And therefore, it's really good to put the card that goes and gets the partner in crime for Crucible, which is Stripline, or a fetch land for you, so that you can take advantage of the Crucible you're already running. So, if you, this is a card that, it's kind of like your 99th card in a deck when you have a deck that's super strong with tons of options and everything's just amazing. This card doesn't quite fit into that category, but it's a card that you're going to try your best to put in every deck to the maximum degree possible, even in a deck like Edric. And because in a deck like that, you've got even better targets. You've got Guy's Cradle. Who needs Strip Mine when you can just play a land that produces who knows how much mana? In a deck like Oloro, you've got Mishra's Workshop. And in fact, speaking of Mishra's Workshop, let's look at our lands right now. So we're looking at lands right now. First off, let me just kind of move the basics together. I'm going to kind of like separate these into piles that make sense to my mind. You can kind of sort yours accordingly to your type of thinking. But basically, what we have is we've got fetches, colorless mana producers. We have off-color, like your splash color duels, and your on-color duels. So say off-color and on-color. What am I talking about? Well, oh, and then specialty lands, like unique, like lands that are positioned to do something that none of the others do. So when I'm talking about off-color and on-color, what I'm talking about is cards that are the off and on-color lands are. Notice that my deck is blue-based. So in a blue-based deck, all of my lands, all of my basic lands, at a minimum, should be lands that allow me to play. I should have enough lands to cover my requirements for every card in my main color. So in my deck, I'm running. Let me explain that one. I'm running. Excuse me. Boy, I'm drawing a blank. Future Sight. I'm running Future Sight and Cryptic Command. Those require blue, blue, blue casting costs. So at a minimum, my deck needs to have three, and blue is my main color. So at a minimum, my deck needs to have 3 islands in order to cover the cost of playing those cards. Okay. I have more than 3 because I run land tax, and I would like to be able to tax up 3 lands, play one, and then do cheaty things where I put 3 cards back and then just keep taxing the same lands and still want to be able to take advantage of the first tax by getting the land drop. That's why I have that. But you don't necessarily have to have a basic land to cover your cost requirements in your splash colors, and I don't, because there are enough duels to do it. I would like to have in a swamp, and at one point in the old days I had a swamp and a plains in the Allura deck to cover my splash white and splash black cards. But I'm not doing that anymore because I use dual lands to do the same thing. So I'm using my dual lands, they're covering those splash colors, and what that allows me to do is continue to focus on, and then of course in your main colors you're going to use the dual lands that give you your splash colors. That's kind of a given, hopefully. But it's just the splash colors that I'm talking about. Because what you don't want to do is play too many cards in your splash colors. You want to play too many land drops in your splash colors that allows your opponent to strip Wasteland, Dust Bowl, or whatever so that all you have access to is your off-color mana, and you're sitting there. And in a blue deck, what is the color that everyone's going to attack first? It's almost always going to be your islands. They're going to attack your blue mana first. In a green deck, where it's pretty clear you're dumping a bunch of green sources into play, they might attack your splash colors because you have things like elves and stuff that make extra green mana. They might attack your splash colors, but in a blue deck, it's almost always going to be your islands. So if I have too many lands that don't produce blue, then I'm just making it easier for an opponent to disrupt me. And I'm also making my draws even worse. So in addition to my basic land, like meeting my basic land requirements of 1 for each of my main colors, and then handling the dual land situation, I also have a few factors that I have to pay attention to in the Laurel, but which I'll cover in a sec. But there are a couple of other things that I recommend for everyone's deck. Play the maximum number of fetch lands that you can. If you're playing 3 colors, that means you get 9. If you're playing 2 colors, then you get 4. If you're playing 4 or more colors, you actually can go all the way up to the 10th fetch land, plus there are extra cards like Crows and Verge that'll get 2 dual lands. Acts as an 11th fetch land for you, and Verge is a little slow because it comes in with tap, but because it gets 2 dual lands, it's probably worthwhile. And then on top of my recommendation, play the maximum number of fetch lands for smoothing your mana base out, for consistency, for comboing with Sensei's Dividing Top and so forth, for comboing with Crucible. You should also play, if you can, these 3 lands here. At a minimum, though, you're going to be playing Command Tower. But in a format with 40 life, there's almost no reason not to play Confluence and City of Brass. I mean, you have to have I don't know what kind of deck you would have where you would worry about life, considering you're starting at 40, more than you would worry about colors of mana. So just play all 3 of these. So your mana base to start. The other 2 cards that you're going to play, by the way, all the time, or should be playing, is Strip and Waste. As long as you can afford, and a Wasteland's expensive, but we're assuming price isn't the issue here, and you're going to be working towards whatever. You're going to play Strip and Waste because they're the most efficient and effective at doing what they do, and they work best with Crucible compared to a card like Dust Bowl that's really slow, Tectonic Edge, you can't always use it, Encroaching Waste, which is really slow, and so on and so forth. So these are your go-to cards with Crucible. These are your anti Broken Lands cards. Broken Lands, Workshop, Gaia's Cradle, and so forth. Anti-Man Land strategy. So here's the depending on what your color combination is, you're going to have 14 or less if you have less fetches. You can use more if you're in more colors, but you're going to have that as a minimum. Plus, you're going to have your at least, if you're blue based, you're going to have at least 3 islands. Um, so we'll set that aside. If you're another color like green and you have triple green, then you'll have 3 forests and so on and so forth. You're going to have your dual lands. If you're in 2 colors, then you don't have anywhere near as many dual lands. But they just printed some new ones that come into play tapped, unless you control a certain number of basic lands. Prairie, like in my colors, it's like prairie something, and anyway, so you can actually have, if you're 2 colors, you can actually have 6 dual lands. You just use the 2 that come into play tapped. And if you're 3 colors, you can have 6 dual lands. So you're always going to have at least 6 dual lands, right? Now, on top of these things, you should always, always, always play Ancient Tomb for the same reasons that you're always going to play Soul Ring. If you're not, like, it's a 40 life format. The damage does not matter. But the fact that you can have 2 mana on turn 1, the fact that we've already said, you're going to be trying to run talismans and that type of stuff, the fact that this is just another Soul Ring for you to play on the first turn should always be in your deck. So there's another card that you're going to have. And what that leaves is just a tiny handful of cards that you need to worry about when you're building your mana base. Now, in my specific case, for Oloro, I'm running Cephalid Coliseum because, again, it's Oloro, and so even if in a 40 life format, I wouldn't care about the damage. In a 40 life format where I'm gaining life, I absolutely don't care about the damage. But the fact that this allows me to sometimes fix a mid-game problem with my hand, for me makes it worthwhile, and it gives me an extra blue card to go with my basic land. I'm also running an extra basic land because in my deck I'm going to cram as many basic lands as I can for land tax. I'm going to cram as many duels as I can, as many specialty lands, and then with space I have left, as many basic lands to tax with. And the space I had left in my case was 1. So I add an extra basic. I add the Coliseum. In your deck, in your colors, you might find something else. If you're mono green, for example, like I said, instead of Cephalid Coliseum, which, is wonderful and all, you get Gaia's Cradle, which is like insane. If you're in black, you get Urborg. I'm in black already, so I get to play both. But this is your color-specific specialty lands. If you're in white, there's Sarah's Sanctum, but probably doesn't belong in anybody's deck, unless you're building something funky. There just aren't that many cards in white. If you're in red, there aren't that many cards in red. Sorry, but at least maybe Valakut. You could probably run Valakut in red, if you're playing enough red. Yeah, white kind of gets the short end of the stick. And then lastly, if you look at Artifact base, outside of the people who are playing with alternate mana sources in green, for everybody else, look how many artifacts we're running, potentially. So with that many artifacts, a Black Lotus, basically, for your artifacts, that you can use over and over, absolutely belongs in your deck. So this is the mana base at a minimum for basically any deck. And when you get less, and you're in 2 colors, and you're running less, like in green, you just replace Workshop with Cradle or whatever. But in I suppose you could play both in the right deck. But this is at least the basic mana base for a deck. But in order to run as few lands as I have, when I say the base mana base, what I mean is the framework, the skeleton. Now in Oloro, I have very specific reasons for why I'm playing the mana base the way that I am. Part of the reason why I'm playing Godless Shrine as well as Scrubland is that I want to have extra. I have a card called Tide that lets me go and get planes, and I need extra targets because sometimes I've already fetched out, a Tundra and a Hallowed Fountain and stuff, and I still want to be able to get 2 lands. It's a card that lets me get up to 2 planes, and I want to get 2 for 1 and generate an advantage. And I've actually been thinking about running the come to play tapped blue-white land. I'm not sure if I will, as a 5th target, just because of that reason. So there are other considerations. There are other considerations for your mana base based on your deck. But as a basic framework, this framework that I was discussing about your colorless lands, your tricolored lands, your fetch lands, how to build your basic land and stuff, always playing Ancient Tomb and that type of thing, Wasteland and Strip. I stand by that as the fundamental foundation for any mana base. Um, what does Black have? Oh, Black has Cabal Coffers. Yeah, that's right. Now I remember what Black has. Not just Urborg, but if you're playing enough Black, you can run Cabal Coffers. You get Lake of the Dead. Black's got a lot of good stuff. Anyway, so that's it for lands. We colored lands and artifacts. So why? I've been talking a lot about blue base. So let's take a look at why I think blue should be the base color for the format. What I've done is I've taken the Alara deck and stripped out cards that I don't think necessarily belong in any blue deck, and just left the ones that probably do. So I'll talk about some of the obvious ones. The two most obvious cards that you should be playing in blue are the two best counterspells ever printed. You should be playing Force of Will and Mana Drain. Now the problem with Mana Drain, because Mana Drain often acts as a counterspell that gives you an invisible Grim Monolith that you get to use on the next turn and then it goes away or something. And Force of Will, because Force of Will, well, you don't need me to explain to you why Force of Will is good. But the thing about Force of Will is you've got to run enough blue cards to actually make Force of Will viable for you to use. And I believe that the amount you need to run is roughly 20. So if you look, I've got 20 blue cards here laid out. You can certainly play more. You can also make adjustments to the ones, but these are the ones that I've picked as what I think make the most suitable cards for any blue deck to run, even a creature-based deck, whatever it is. So let's touch on the rest. So we covered. Sorry, I shouldn't have sorted that there. We covered Force of Will. Come on, freaking magic. All right, so we covered Force of Will and Mana Drain, the obvious ones, but let's look at some of the others. Why are the others in here? I probably don't need to explain to you why Jace is in here. Card advantage engine wins the game, protects itself. Completely awesome. Jace is usually described as a reusable brainstorm on a stick because that's the most notable feature, because reusable brainstorm is completely insane. If reusable brainstorm is insane, then brainstorm kind of makes the cut because, you know, this is what we're comparing it to, so we'll play at least a temporary brainstorm, right? But also brainstorm's crazy with the fetches and stuff. Just make sure when you play cards like brainstorm and Sensei's Divining Top, you're not relying on, if you're monocolor, you're not relying on 4 fetches. Like, find other ways to shuffle your deck to make sure that these cards work for you. Otherwise, you know, you're not really doing yourself a lot of favors. Speaking of ways to do that, here's 1 and 2 that are very well costed, that let you get rid of the junk cards from Brainstorm, fix mulligans and stuff, and have been restricted in various formats. There isn't a lot to say about these cards, other than the fact that you can run a lower mana count, lower mana land count, when you're running more ways to find mana early on in the game, and these cards do that very well. Meanwhile, another card that does that very well, it doesn't do it on turn 1 though, but does it on turn 2, is Impulse, which I'm not playing, because not every deck will, not every deck necessarily wants to play a draw-go effect, but Condescend, which I am playing, because it's kind of like Impulse in that when you play a Condescend, if the top 2 cards aren't land, you scry them to the bottom and then you draw a card. You've gone 3 cards deep on turn 2, but the reason we pick this over Impulse in every deck is that Condescend is a card that will prevent your opponent from taking over the game really quick with something like an early Sylvan Library, or Rofellos, or Dark Confidant, or whatever, and scales very well to the rest of the game, considering all the extra artifact mana we're running and stuff. It's good at every point in the game, just like the other cards are. So Condescend is a card that we use to cheat on mana just a little bit. Mystical Tutor is in here specifically because of the power and flexibility of it, but if you'll notice, you can get the 2 best cards in the game, and the number 1 card, the number 1 counter spell is actually, I guess the argument could be Force of Will, but let's just say it's Mana Drain, given that one's legal in one format and banned in the other. And Mystical Tutor goes and gets that. So we're going to play Mystical Tutor in our deck because sometimes we just need to mana drain something early in order to get our engine going, and then we can spew out artifact mana and take it from there. Speaking of spewing out artifact mana, Tezzeret does a very good job of this. Midway through the game, it rewards you for playing with all those artifacts, and it goes and gets Winter Orb, and it untaps artifacts and produces extra mana, sometimes producing more mana than you cast, that it costs you to cast them in the first place. And because he's super flexible, if you're playing a creature-based deck, you can run Sword of Feast and... speaking of if you're playing a creature-based deck, I didn't cover this in the artifact section, but I'll mention it here. There are certain pieces of equipment you should be playing in just about every creature-based deck. Again, have a good reason why you're not if you are. And those are Umezawa's Jite, Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice, and Skull Clamp. Those are the 4 cards that belong in every creature-based deck, unless you know of some special reason why you're not playing them. Tezzeret gets all of them without dying, which is awesome. So if you're running Tezzeret in a control setup, he's fantastic. He goes and gets shackles and all that good stuff. If you're running him in a creature-based setup, he's fantastic. He goes and gets Vitae, swords, and all that stuff. He's just fantastic. You should put him in all your decks. Forbid. What are the best cards in the format? They are Mana Crypt and Soul Ring. Well, what goes and gets those cards very well? Trinket Mage does. We're going to play Trinket Mage. If we don't have those targets, this is why we're running Sensei's Divining Top, and we also have, of course, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, rather. There's other things that we can target. And if you have all your cards in play, for example, you've got your top, Crypt, Vault, and whatnot in play, you can activate top, and then Trinket Mage for the top you just activated, and still not miss a beat. So we're going to run Trinket Mage. And then, again, cards like top and stuff make Tezzeret even better as well. So this just belongs in a blue-based deck. Forbid belongs in every blue-based deck because it allows you to turn jump draws into real draws. Every 2 lands you draw is half a counterspell. So if you got unlucky and you're in top decking mode and you top deck a blank, you have Forbid and a blank card, and they draw a blank, and then you draw a blank, and then they draw a relevant spell. You get a Forbid's buyback, throwing away 2 blanks, and now if you draw a blank and they draw another relevant spell, you get to counter that one too. Besides which, if you have a significant advantage in cards, you can actually lock an entire game out and just win with a single Forbid in the right situations. For example, Tezzeret has fetched a Sword of Feast and Famine. You're hitting them with it. They have no cards in hand. Tezzeret has, plussed up and fetched you a Sword of Fire and Ice. Now you're drawing 2 cards per turn. Now every time they draw a card, if they play it, you cast Forbid with buyback using your draw phase and the card you draw off your Sword of Fire and Ice. If they don't play it, hit them with the Sword of Feast and Famine and they discard it. It basically locks them out of the game. Not completely, and I'm not going to get into the caveats of that, but you get my drift. It's a crazy card. Cryptic Command, super flexible card. If you're playing blue, you should just be playing Cryptic Command, and the reason is that you can save yourself from a lot of situations that very few cards can do without losing card advantage. You can bounce a Planeswalker before it ultimates. You can tap all your opponent's creatures just to protect one of your own Planeswalkers or your life total, or to keep them from hitting you with an equipped creature, even if that creature has Shroud. And of course, the whole counterspell thing is pretty nice too. You can also use it as a form of land destruction. If you get a nice start on mana and your opponent plays a second turn bounce land like Simic Growth Chamber, and that's all they've got in play, you can Cryptic that back to their hand, draw a card, not lose card advantage, and set them back to like no mana in play at all, which is tremendous. It's like a Time Walk with a card draw on it. It's completely insane. It belongs in every blue deck that has the mana to play it. And considering you want to play Force of Will and you're going to have to play enough blue spells to make it good, that means you're going to have to play enough islands to make Cryptic Command reasonable to play. And now you see why the mana base works as a 3-island minimum basic land mana base. So, so early defenses, Mana Leak, Remand, Counterspell, of course, and Spell Pierce all have the property of being able to keep you from losing the game to early permanents that are too powerful. Things like Sylvan Library, Dark Confidant, Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, and so forth. You really don't want your opponent to have access to these cards at all. But you especially don't want them to have access to those cards early. So playing cards like this will help keep your opponent from doing that. Provided, you've had a turn. I mean, if they get a nut draw and drop a first turn Mana Crypt, whatever, and you can't spell pierce it because you haven't had a turn yet. Well, that's unfortunate. But the point is, excuse me, your best chance for dealing with those cards in a normal game will be the cheapest possible counterspell. So run them. And the reason why we run these specific ones in the case of counterspell is obvious. Spell pierce, because you can go first turn spell pierce and you can counter either crypt or soul ring with it, which is very important. You may also bolster this package, by the way, with mental misstep, just to stop a first turn soul ring when you're going second. But spell pierce, but that's a preference call. Spell pierce, on the other hand, is not really a preference call. It's kind of mandatory because it'll stop both cards even going second, not just one of them. And it stops a whole bunch of other things too. It's also really good for winning counter wars. Remand and Mana Leak are also really good for winning counter wars. Remand can be a way to dig for mana early in the game. And Mana Leak, by the time the game gets late, remember, you are the one running Crucible and Winter Orb, so Mana Leak should be good still. You've got to make sure that those cards are good, but these two cards also have really good synergy together. They play a card, you remand it back to their hand, they play it again, and now you can Mana Leak it because you basically doubled the cost of their card without losing card advantage because you for a replacement remand. That's why that's awesome. Muddle the Mixture's in there because Muddle the Mixture is a demonic tutor for Winter Orb. It's also a demonic tutor for Mana Drain. It goes against Scroll Rack if you decided you wanted to play that, but mainly it goes against Winter Orb. It's also really good because it's a counterspell that helps you win counterspell wars. So it's a flexible card, and the more cards you play in the 2 zone, when you build your deck, you're going to look at the fact that any card you play that costs 2 mana is just a little bit better because you have Muddle the Mixture in your deck and you can fetch it out. Speaking of Demonic Tutor, Muddle the Mixture is a Demonic Tutor for Demonic Tutor. So if you ever need to chain tutors together to get something in your hand, Muddle the Mixture lets you do that. Speaking of chaining tutors, you should be playing Merchant Scroll. So why? Because you can tap out for Merchant Scroll and go get Force of Will and actually have a counterspell ready to go when you might not have been able to. Maybe you only have a blue and a colorless mana source, and you don't have any counterspell in your hand that will protect you. You have actual counterspell and stuff that you can't cast with that. But you have Merchant Scroll, you go scroll for Force of Will, and you're set. If you don't, early on in the game, you can scroll for a Mana Drain, and then you can sit on 2 blue for the game and just threaten them with Mana Drain and do nothing, and buy tons of time. And then as you get more mana, start deploying your threats. And they're still sitting there trying to figure out how to get around Mana Drain. Or they decide to be bold and play into it, and then you just get this huge mana rush and reward yourself with that. So because it gets the 2 best cards in the game, they're counters in the game, Merchant Scroll belongs in the deck, but it also gets card drawing as well. You can also chain Muddle Merchant Scroll to fetch other specific cards, like you can scroll for Muddle for Tutor, Demonic, for example, if you're playing it, Demonic for whatever, or you can Merchant Scroll for Muddle and Muddle for Sylvan Library, one of the best green cards in the game, and so on and so forth. You can Merchant Scroll for Mystical Tutor, and then Mystical Tutor for any sorcery or instant. So this, even though it says it only gets a blue instant, this can actually get any sorcery or instant in your deck, provided you tutor chain it together if you want to. And speaking of instants you might want to get, Cyclonic Rift belongs in every blue deck because, again, I've been talking about mana so much, but consider that we're running Winter Orb and the opponent may have tons of artifact mana or alternate mana sources in play. In that situation, some colors can kill all of their artifact mana or all their creature mana pretty easily. Like if it's all creature mana, white can Wrath of God. If it's all artifact mana, red can Vandal Blast. But what can blue do? Well, I know we're going to be playing blue for sure. And the only thing that I know of that blue can do to deal with, excuse me, either one of those situations on a one-sided basis is Cyclonic Rift. Beyond that, it's it can steal tempo if they it can actually produce, you can actually break even on card advantage. You're not always down, because if you bounce stuff to their hand and they have to discard, then you've actually made up for the lost card. If they use a first turn mana vault and then second turn they play a gigantic drop, and you second turn you bounce it at the end of their turn, it's going to be a lot of time, maybe never, before they get to replay that card, depending on how the game goes. So Cyclonic Rift is just one of those cards that too powerful not to use. It's one-sided, but it's also in there as a nod to the power of the format and the fact that people should be playing cards like Mana Crypt, or excuse me, Mana Vault and Grim Monolith. And lastly, copy artifacts in there because people should be playing Mana Crypt, Grim Monolith, Soul Ring, and Mana Vault. And you might not have one. And when you don't have one, how do you keep up? That's the most important thing you can ask yourself in this format. What do I do? How do I get those cards in my hand? And what do I do when I don't have them? And one of the things you can do is you can just copy theirs, and now you've matched them in mana, and you can continue the game without being at a deficit. So this is the package of cards I recommend for every blue deck. And I will say that there are other cards that are strong standouts, like Future Sight, like Mental Misstep, and a few others that could all be good, like Fabricate, which is basically a trinket mage for any artifact, but it doesn't add a body. And actually, to be honest, um, this card may very well be. I may be wrong not including this in here. In fact, I probably am, because the more I think about it, I think I am, because you just want to get those Soul Rings and those Mana Crypt draws as much as you possibly can, and those help you do it. The other cards that you can possibly include in here are Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. I don't have enough experience with them in this format to say that definitively, and I don't want to give advice that I can't back up with actual, like, testimony I can't back up with actual gameplay experience. Finally, there's a card that if you're in the right color combination, belongs in this list, and that's Mystical Teachings, because it's a tutor card. But you have to be playing black for this card to be in your deck. But this would go into the mandatory pile because it's a tutor card that allows you to tutor again, which means that you can use this to win counterspell wars. Starts by fetching, and at the end of their turn, you fetch yourself a mana drain or a counterspell. And then a couple turns later, you fetch yourself a Force of Will. And then the turn after that, you start a fight with them that you're going to win because you've got multiple counters to back it up, some of which are free. The only other card that I would say is very close to being mandatory, but is not, is in this color, is Fact or Fiction. And the reason I say it's close is that if you're not playing a deck like Edric, where you're going to be using, you're expecting to draw a lot of cards early, then Fact or Fiction probably is mandatory for a blue deck. But if you are playing Edric, or if you're playing some kind of combo deck where you just can't afford to lose the cards at all, then I suppose Fact or Fiction could be considered too dangerous to play. But outside of those weird corner cases, then it is mandatory. But because there are corner cases where you may not want to use it, I mean, there's a whole expression, EOT, FOF, YL, and for new players who haven't heard it, it means end of your turn, Fact or Fiction, you lose. End of turn, Fact or Fiction, you lose. And it comes from the days when Fact or Fiction was in Standard. And essentially, the first person who resolved the Fact or Fiction would get so much of an advantage in a game that it almost was always correct that by the end of the game, that person had won. So it started becoming EOTFOFYL because you would basically just, as soon as you cast it on turn 4, you basically just won the game if it resolved. Even though the handwriting was on the wall, even though it hadn't been said and done. That's how strong the card drawing is off Fact or Fiction, and while it's a little bit weaker in a commander format, it's still very, which has like all kinds of powerful broken things. Standard at that time was a much less powerful format than the one we're playing now, but it's still a really great card. So in a deck that's not playing Edric style, like constant hand refilling, Fact or Fiction probably belongs in this list. So there's a lot of, that's 20 to 21 to 22, maybe even 23, depending on what your color combination, mandatory blue cards that you're going to be playing. Excuse me. Possibly more. I haven't tried cruising big enough. So now you start to see why I say most decks should probably be blue based. But if they're not, then these cards obviously aren't mandatory. It's just that if they are, you've got a huge pile of cards that you should be playing. Um, and there are other cards like Fact or Fiction that fit into the mold too of cards that you should be playing if you're not playing Edric, or cards that can't take advantage of them. Impulse comes to mind, Thirst for Knowledge comes to mind, and of course I had mentioned Fact or Fiction, and there's a few others. Um, but I just wanted to cover the most important ones, the absolute critical key ones. Uh, you can probably make tiny adjustments to this list. Like I said, mental misstep. You could probably take Condescend off if you really hate it. I think that's wrong, but you can. You could add a few cards in here or whatever, but essentially this is the bare bones. Like you should be playing these cards in these colors, or know why you're not. If you're going to be playing blue at all. So let's look at what green has. It's mandatory. Well, first of all, if you are playing blue, then this card should be somewhere in your deck. It should be your commander, but if for some reason you want to play like a green blue red deck, a green blue black deck, or whatever, then this card should be in your deck somewhere. Unless you're a combo deck with like no creatures. But that's weird because why are you playing green if you want to play creatures? I don't know, some people do, and that's fine. Outside of that weird situation, though, this card is completely insane. It's an insane commander. It's been banned in one format. I don't respect, again, the French list or whatever. I think it's a terrible format. But anyway, I'll talk about that some other time. But the point is, it's extremely powerful, and just the reason is where it falls on the curve and the amount of cards it can draw. And you notice like how many times I said, well, you don't need to play this if you're playing this guy. Well, he has such a effect on the game when he's doing his business, when he's doing his thing, when he's giving you cards. That spending 4 mana to get a card when you can just turn a creature sideways and spend 0 to get multiple cards off all your creatures. He actually makes a card that would be mandatory, if not for him, no good, for the most part. So that's how good that guy is, and you should most definitely be playing him in your blue-green X decks that have creatures in them, if he's not your commander. But what cards are mandatory in green? Not that much. At least not in my opinion, and not from what I've seen. There's a new card. Well, first let's cover the old cards. There's Regrowth and Sylvan Library. I think these two cards are... Regrowth is Demonic Tutor for your graveyard. If your card, whatever your card was good enough for them to kill it, then it's probably a card you want back in your hand. If it's a card you used to dig through your library, it's a card you probably want back in your hand. I mean, if it was useful once, it may be useful again. So in general, just Regrowth, belongs, and it's cheap. It's really cheap, so it lets you work with a fetch land to hit a mana drop as a sort of weak rampant growth. Basically a rampant growth that doesn't come into play tap. When you don't have a land drop in your hand, but you've got one in your graveyard, then it's basically rampant growth. The land, you hit your land drop. So too flexible, too good, play it. Sylvan Library, on the other hand, is a 40 life format. This card basically says draw 3 cards every turn for the next 9 turns. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but that's basically what it says. For 2 mana, if you don't play this card, you don't even know how to play this game. And if you don't draw extra cards with this card, which is the thing that so many people fail to do, then you don't know what you're doing in this game. You should be drawing extra cards because even if you don't want the cards on top, draw extra cards and then find the cards you do want in the next group of 3. The only time you shouldn't be drawing is when you have shuffle effects, too many cards in your hand, or you have some other special reason why you know that you don't want to draw them. I don't know, motion play, or something like that. Okay? So, Sylvan's totally mandatory. Nature's Claim. Why is Nature's Claim mandatory? Well, Nature's Claim is mandatory, in my opinion, because Soul Ring and Mana Crypt again. If they get the Soul Ring or the Mana Crypt draw, and you have the Nature's Claim draw, you can immediately set them back to a normal development phase. Even if you don't have a way to keep up with them, you can even things out. And you can do it on the first turn whether or not you went first. You can just draw, play land, play claim, or you've already played your land and you claim their card immediately. So for that reason, it's super effective, and it also, because it kills artifacts and enchantments, allows you to deal with Sylvan Library, and some of the other broken enchantments that are out there. So it's just incredibly flexible. And who gives it? But who cares if you're giving them 4 extra life in a 40 life format? You're giving them 10% more life. Who cares? You're not going to be beating them down anyway in this format. So the life is irrelevant. But the cheap cost. Also, keep in mind that we've been talking about Winter Orb and why we want to play Winter Orb. Well, the cheap cost allows you to get out from under an orb. So if they have you under orb lock, soft lock, where they don't have like counters and stuff backing it up or whatever, you can just play a forest, play a Nature's Claim on the Winter Orb at the appropriate time, and get yourself out from under that box. So for the same exact reason, this new card that was printed, Natural State, I think absolutely is a card that I would recommend in every green deck. I was using Crumble at one point, as well as a couple other cards like that. Cards that only target artifacts. But this card destroys artifacts or enchantments with converted mana cost 3 or less. Well, that's basically every single, everything that really matters and really affects the game the most. Necropotence, Sylvan Library, Soul Ring, Winter Orb, Vedokin Shackles, this Worn Power Stone. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's all natural state. What is it? Natural state? Yeah, natural state targetable at the same cost. It's basically another Nature's Claim. You don't give them a 4 life, but you can't target things that cost 4 or more. But you're going to be able to hit the majority of what's important in the format. And so every green deck should be playing these. 100% all of your green decks. I think. If you're not playing these, I don't know what you're doing. It's not right. Beyond that, there are cards you could recommend, and I don't have the full list here. If you're playing certain deck strategies like Edric. If you're playing Edric, you want green creatures that produce mana on turn 1. Birds of Paradise, Noble Hierarch. I guess, I don't know if you can use him. No, you can't use him. But Llanowar Elves, Finhorn Elves, and all those kinds of cards. If you're playing a creature-based green deck mana ramp strategy, you want creatures that produce more mana, that just like you do with artifacts, you want creatures to produce more mana than they cost, or have the potential to. So Priest of Titania, Rofellos, the one that the Lotus, the one that produces a mana of any, it's Sylvan something. I'll look it up real quick. It's is it Sylvan? No, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not Sylvan something. Okay. Well, anyway, the point is, well, Sylvan Caryatid. That's another reasonable card to be playing in green. Although it's not necessarily mandatory, but it's a pretty good one. It depends on how many colors your deck is. Basically, if you're 3 or more colors, I would say play Caryatid. If you're playing, there's also the one that produces one for each type of color of permanent you control. So it has the potential to produce anywhere from 1 to 5 mana, depending on how many colors of mana you have. Basically, remember 3s are magic numbers, so you probably should play the one green elf who gives you a mana for each elf you control, like a Priest of Titania does. Probably, but not necessarily, for the same reason as the Basalt Monolith. And as for the rest, as far as non-mana producing things goes in green, if you're playing a creature-based deck, you should be playing the combination of Natural Order and Terrestrial. Without question. I mean, it makes no sense not to play this. This is a 4-mana card that goes and fetch that goes and fetches this big guy. If I can spell him. There he is. There's Big Papa. Who destroys 3. Basically, this is a 4-mana card you can play without having this in your hand that lets you destroy triple Vindicate, which would normally cost 9 mana. So this combo is just absolutely sick, and one of the best reasons to play creatures in green. Period. So put it in your deck. The other thing you should be playing if you're playing creatures is you should be playing Gaia's Cradle. And because you're playing Gaia's Cradle, I would strongly recommend playing the Ranged Hermit. In addition to giving you an extra guys that you can natural order away, because that should be in your deck, In addition to working very well with cards like Edric and stuff, it's incredibly cool with Gaia's Cradle. Works. It's an elf for Priest of Titania, and it's just generally awesome. Another card you should play in green, if you're playing creatures at all, is Eternal Witness. For the same reason you're playing Regrowth. Just one more mana, get that body attached, and do good things. A card you should strongly consider if you're playing green is Birthing Pod, but just make sure that it makes sense in your deck. It's definitely a card I would want to do something about if my opponent has it in play. But for all that, you may not be playing all those creatures, and that's why I haven't included them. But no matter what, put these 4 cards in your deck, please. As far as red goes, okay, so let's assume you're not playing any other color. If you're only playing red, these are the only cards I can recommend as cards. I would say, let me do it this way. These are the 2 cards in red that you should play no matter what, 100%. The ability to, it's the same deal as the 2 green 1-mana removal spells, the Soul Ring killers. And for that reason, I suggest Shatter Spree. I know not everybody agrees with me on this, but I think that the ability to kill a Soul Ring on turn 1 is way too good to pass up. And the ability to smoke multiple mana sources with 1 card, especially a card that's almost impossible to counterspell, is just too good. Even though, and that's how Shattering Spree is. Vandal Blast, on the other hand, is possible to counterspell, but wow, does that have some serious potential. For 5 mana, you can just wipe somebody's board out. You can often win the game with just a Vandal Blast. And if you look at some of my old deck lists, like Sliver Queen, you'll see games that just end on a Vandal Blast. I've got Winter Orb, they've got tons of artifact mana, I've got tons of artifact. It's not affecting any of us, and I maneuver the whole game just to resolve a Vandal Blast, and boom, game's over. Bolt is the most efficient removal spell in its color, and really good and flexible, and it presents a constant threat if your opponent has Planeswalkers, that they can't allow their Planeswalker to get too low. Sometimes just the existence of Bolt will cause someone who plays a Jace to +2 it. So a card that people have to play out around like that and is super effective. Oh, by the way, Bolt is also it's the most played, I think it's the single most played card across Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, even Vintage. You can't say like Ancestral because it's only playable in one format or whatever. Or Force of Will isn't playable in Modern, but across all 3 formats, from what if I remember correctly, Bolt is the actual card that shows up in the most deck lists. It's just that good and efficient. It belongs in any red deck. So I would say because of the format, you play these 2. Because of the power of the card and flexibility, you play this one. And then moving on from there, if you're playing green, red with green, include Ancient Grudge in the mix. Include it in the mix because even though you've already got these 2 cards, because you're not going to go wrong with extra artifact removal in the format. If they don't have targets, then their deck probably sucks, and you're going to beat them anyway, because if you've been following my advice, you're going to be the one who has all the fast mana, or you're going to have all the cool equipment, and they won't have any of that stuff, which means they can't possibly compete with you. Not really, not realistically, consistently. And if they do have targets, then you can't go wrong with an Ancient Grudge. A very hard to counterspell effect that often generates card advantage is a very good card to play. If you're not playing green, but you're playing blue, then these are the cards I recommend. I recommend Fire and Ice, because Fire can get you card advantage. Ice can cycle itself for only 2 mana. Ice can steal you tempo. You can go land, they go land, you go land, and then during their upkeep you ice their land, and it's almost like they're still stuck on their first turn. And so you finally get hit your 3rd mana drop, and they because when they play their second land, the first one's tapped. So now they're still stuck on 1 mana, and then on the next turn you've got 3 mana ready to go. The other thing about ice that's important in this format is that so you can force a will with it. Notice all 3 cards in the blue section can force a will with. But let's talk about what's the other 2 cards that I recommended are really good in artifacts. Mana Vault and Grim Monolith, and both of those essentially die to an ice, or they die for quite a while. I mean, if you go land and they go first turn Mana Vault, but they don't have a play, and you're worried, okay, oh boy, their commander's 5 mana, it's coming down on turn 2, and you go ice or Mana Vault, draw a card. It's going to be a long time probably before they untap that mana ball. It's a huge swing in tempo. Definitely play this card. It's so flexible. It's so good. I see no reason to not run it. When you can cycle it for so cheap. And you can also model the mixture for it. And so this is what I was talking about. And if you look at the red cards, by the way, when I said the green card, guess what else you can model for? Red, that's right. So when I was talking about model the mixture and how it affects our card decisions as well, look at our green cards, Growth and Sylvan Library. So that comes up time and time again as well, where if you're playing blue, you're playing muddle. If you're playing muddle, 2-mana cards get even better. And that's why we're not really playing Electrolyze, because, again, it's a matter of tempo and curve. But at 3 mana, what we do have, you're not going to tap an artifact mana source with Electrolyze, for example. What we do have at 3 mana that you can do is you can just flat out steal the sucker. Dak Faden is one of the strongest planeswalkers in the game right now, and is totally everywhere in artifact-dominated formats. The fact that it just gives you an incredible ability, the theft, a permanent theft, as well as this unbelievably good card selection for so cheap, and you can force with it. And he starts with 3, and if you plus him up 4 loyalty counters, he's fairly durable. He's just a great card, a card that I really wish I could play in every blue deck, and unfortunately I can't because of the commander I have. But boy, would I play this card in a heartbeat if I could. Incidentally, if you're playing green, discarding cards with flashback to Dak Faden, pretty cool too. So lastly, Keranos. Keranos is I think you can make an argument for why you wouldn't play it, and your argument could be right. I mean, maybe you're playing a 5-color deck and you just have so many good things to do that you just don't. Maybe you're playing a deck with Necropotence and Keranos, and you intend to skip your draw and maybe. But I mean, I don't know. There's so many things. Like even in that case, you can brainstorm and ponder to trigger it. Like there's so many ways you can ice to trigger it. That this can be good. It's one of those cards that it's a little bit slow and everything, but it gives you a lot of the fact that you get that Lightning Bolt's a marquee card, and you get to Lightning Bolt over and over and over. And when you don't get the Lightning Bolt, you get to draw extra cards. So it's either a Lightning Bolt machine or a Jam Day Tome for a one-time investment. It's probably too much to pass up, and I would put this in the I'm playing blue and red, so I'm going to play Keranos pile. But like I said, it's on that verge because it's 5 mana of being one of those cards that you might not use. But I think it would be wrong not to recommend it very highly and say you probably should be playing this card in these colors. Lastly, here's a card that you would play if you're playing blue and red together. Nin the Paint Artist. It is the best commander in those colors, much like Edric was the best commander in his colors. If people understood how good Nin was, I honestly think that if you were going to play French EDH, everyone thinks that's a fair format, blah, blah, blah. Well, Nin isn't banned, but Edric is. Most fast mana is banned. Nin flourishes in that environment. This is how you really break that environment in half. You run Nin the Paint Artist as your commander, and you just wreck that format. But meanwhile, if you're not playing like a Nin the Paint Artist deck, if you're playing a deck that has access to blue and red, this is a card you should strongly consider. Now, if your deck is like kind of like a Waro control base, and you've got humility in it, then maybe Nin the Paint Artist doesn't make the cut, although Keranos can work in that kind of a deck. Maybe Nin the Paint Artist doesn't make the cut in that specific situation. But otherwise, if you're playing a 5-color deck or something, a 4-color deck, you're playing a 3-color deck, put Nin the Paint Artist and make your deck better for the same reason that Edric does it. And conveniently, if you're in both colors, you'll play both of them. As long as you're playing creatures and you're playing the right colors, then he's great. There's no red-black card that I would feel is mandatory in any deck. There's no red-white card that I feel is mandatory in any deck, as far as like too good to ignore. There are cards that are very good, cards that you could use, like Helix, Lightning, terminate maybe, you know, whatever. Um, but nothing that's so good that I would say I really want to be playing this card all the time, whenever I can, in these colors. While these three cards, and to a lesser extent these two cards, are cards that, if you have the colors to play them, you should. So that's that. Lastly, white and black. So after a lot of experimenting with different options, I would say that the white and black cards that you should play, whenever you can, play them. If you're playing white, you might be playing creature based. If you're playing creature based, Stoneforge becomes a must-play card. Other cards may become must-play cards. I haven't gone through the list entirely. If you're playing black and you're playing creature-based, maybe certain cards are more important than others. If you're playing like mono black, certainly there are cards that are more valuable than others. Like there are more tutors you can run. But no matter what, if you're playing black or white, or both, then in my mind, these are the cards that you should put in your deck, regardless. If you're playing black, you want to play Imperial Seal, Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Yawgmoth Swell, Mind Twist. I think that should be easy for everybody to understand exactly why. They're 100% splashable, they're 100% powerful, incredible cards. As far as the last two that I didn't mention, these two, it's a 40 life format. For the same reason we put Sylvan Library in every deck, we put Dark Confidant in every deck. We don't necessarily put Dark Tutelage, which is the 3-mana enchantment version of Confidant. And the difference is that it's easier to kill a Confidant off when you're sick of them than it is to kill a Tutelage off. But if you're not worried about it, you could include Tutelage on this list, probably. And be right, correct to do so. The card we do, however, put instead of Tutelage is Necropotence. And if you're playing black and you're not playing Necropotence, I have learned, having not played it for a long time, you're doing it wrong. Because this card basically says BBB, win the game. Black, 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 win the game. I have had one game where I resolved a Necro and did not win, and I was already losing by such a monstrous proportion that there was nothing left in my deck to get that could save. Outside of that situation, this card I've never lost with this in play, and most games end the turn I play it for all intents and purposes. So make it work. If you're going to play Necro, just play Urborg. Now we go back to lands and you look and say, okay, now we know why Urborg's in the deck. You're going to play Necro, you're going to play Urborg. If you're playing Necropotence, you're certainly not... you could be playing green-black together, but if you're going to play Necro and you're going to play Urborg, then you should also include a card like... you should also include other ways to help you along your black. Like, you're going to definitely make room for Map for the Urborg. You're also going to play Gilded Lotus. You're going to play that Coalition Relic earlier, because then you can charge it, and that's 2 black right there. You're 2/3 of the way to casting Necropotence, even if you're playing it with green. It's just the way that it is. It's a card that should be banned from the format, but until it is, everybody should be playing it who's running black, and then we can all have fun together, and we can all agree that it needs to be banned together too, hopefully. On the white side, also, as far as these tutor goes, remember, the format is about Mana Crypt, and while you cannot, and Soul Ring, and while red gets 2 ways to kill them on turn 1, and green gets 2 ways to kill them on turn 1, black gets 2 ways to fetch them on turn 1. Use them. You also get an extra way to fetch them on turn 2. One reason black is so good. Excuse me. Remember, all of our decisions are based around the fact that Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are in the format. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's fun and interesting. I just think that it's a bad thing when people don't realize this. On the white side, you've got Enlightened Tutor for Crypt and Soul Ring, or whatever else you're going to do. You've got Disenchant, and in my opinion, Seal of Cleansing as well, because for the same reason that you use Copy Artifact and blue, you want to kill a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt, or Telescent, Sylvan Library and stuff. On turn 2, before they untap and get that 4 mana on their second turn, you don't want them to get to that 400% or double 200% mana base turn. These are two ways you can prevent that from happening. My friend Brian does not place Seal of Cleansing. I I cannot. It's Brian. I can't say he's wrong and feel confident telling you that. But what I can tell you is that I prefer and I believe that the right answer is to have as many ways to deal with a turn 2 Soul Ring Encrypt as possible. So for me, what I want to be doing is running Seal. The other reason I run Seal is because I am playing black in this particular deck, and I want to be able to play permanence when I have a Necro out. I don't want a handful of 7 cards, one of them is Disenchant. I want a handful of 7 cards with a Seal of Cleansing in play. That kind of thing. But meanwhile, for any white deck, killing those 2 cards is very important. If you're a creature-based deck, you're going to want to kill equipment that your opponent has, like GTA, that can shut you down. If you're not a creature-based deck, you definitely want to kill their equipment. Of course, you want to kill their Soul Ring and thing. What's the other card? The third most powerful card? Winter Orb. You want to kill their Orb. If you're a creature-based deck, you want to kill their Vedokin Shackles that they should be playing. Or their Crucible. Like, the format isn't that hard if you understand, if you build the framework and then understand how to interact with it in each of your colors. You still have plenty of room for creativity and flexibility. But you'll prevent yourself, like I said in the beginning, from losing to crazy draws, and then you won't have as many feel bad moments. And like I see people constantly saying, oh well, they got this, and then the game was over. And it's like, well, I look at what color combinations they have, and they should have tons of answers for the problem that they faced, but they're not playing any of them, and it just makes no sense. So that's why I recommend these 2 cards here. Also conveniently notice, this is the other reason why I like Seal. You can Enlighten Tutor for it if you need to. I mean, if they play a card that's just backbreakingly good and it's a targetable, then make your tutors more powerful. Speaking of cards you can Enlighten Tutor for, land tax is basically draw 3 cards for 1. It's why we're playing our basic mana base is at least 3. But if you're playing white, then you want to increase it to 4 or more. I find the optimal level of basic lands is actually 6, and I'm happy with 5. At 4, I'm a little uncomfortable, but in my current situation, with the way that my deck is, I don't see a way to get that 5th land in and be happy, and so be it. But land tax is just crazy good. Of course, it combos with Scroll Rack. That was the card I was talking about way back. If you remember me talking about Scroll Rack. To put lands back in your deck and draw them over and over and over and over and over, and basically draw 4 cards per turn in many cases, by just taxing the same 3 lands, and you guys have seen me do it. It's an incredible combo, but on its own, it allows you to keep 1 mana hands. It's essentially like the Ponder of blue, in that if you have a 1 mana hand with tax, and that land produces white, it's a keepable hand. And Tithe is the exact same thing. It produces, it gets double dual lands. You should always play it if you're playing white. I mean, what's the cost to you for these 1 white cards? It's so cheap, right? It's so easy to fit into any deck. And if you're playing white, just remember though that when you're playing white, again, make sure you have enough planes to Tithe for. I found, again, just like land tax, I've got 4 targets. Tithe, I've got 4 targets. I think 4 is your absolute minimum, but again, I'd feel more comfortable if I had 5, 1 more basic land and 1 more Tithe target. I am thinking about whether or not I want to do something with that. But at a minimum, if you're playing white, you should be playing both tax and Tithe, and make sure you have 4 targets for each. I can just tell you from experience, that's the minimum number you need to make those cards work. Swords of the Plowshares doesn't need any explanation. It's just the best removal spell in the game. Single target and Terminus is Swords of the Plowshares for everything, so play it, because even if you're ahead, you don't need it, and you're going to win. If you're behind, you do need it, and you don't want to spend a lot of mana playing it. And you can often win a game with Terminus. It's too good. It's kind of like Balance, which we would play if it was legal, in the sense that you never want to have to play it, You never regret playing it when you need it, though, and nothing else compares to the card when you need it. So that's the white card that you should always be running. And the reason specifically why Terminus is not only can you play it for one white, depending on your color combinations, with a great deal of consistency, but it also, by tucking things, it prevents triggers from when so-and-so goes to the graveyard or dies. It also prevents recursion on certain index that have that capability. It's just too doggone good. So run Terminus. Mind Twist is your massive card advantage by destruction of their cards in black. Terminus is your massive card advantage by destruction of their cards in white. And then if you happen to be playing both colors, you should always run Vindicate. It's just the most flexible removal spell in terms of what it can do in the game. Not the best costed. Swords to Plowshares is the best for creatures, Disenchant's the best for artifacts, and so forth. But in terms of just pure flexibility, I know of no card that's as good as a Vindicate, other than maybe a Chaos Orb, and that's not legal. As far as cards that are splashable, I think I already mentioned if you're playing blue and you're running black, you should be running Mystical Teachings. And as far as cards that are splashable from the other combinations, I don't know of any black-red card that's mandatory. I don't know of a black-green card that's mandatory, although I don't know if Abrupt Decay, I don't think you can call it mandatory, so no. Black-white, I don't know of any mandatory card other than Vindicate. In white-blue, I can't think of anything that you have to play, or should, or like you're doing it wrong if you don't play it. And in white-red, I can't think of a card like that. And in white-green, I do not know of any card like that either. So maybe you guys can help me out if I missed something. But as far as I can tell, this list is all of the cards that I would say are mandatory in their colors, the lands that are mandatory, like in how we build the land. We kind of talked about how that works and stuff. What I'm going to do is, I wonder if it's possible to move cards from one. No, it's not possible. Okay. So if we actually add up the totals in these colors, 7, 7, and 1 is 15, right? I'm not playing red or green in Alaro. And now maybe you see why. In the colors, the cards are the card that has the most mandatory cards is blue, right? The one with the next most mandatory. And when I say mandatory, I don't mean you have to play blue. What I mean is mandatory in the sense of if you're playing blue, you have to play these cards, or you really should. So if you're playing green and red, they have the least amount. Although green's number goes up if you include creatures. If your intent is to play creatures, then the number goes up by quite a bit. It's the next most. It's the color with the next highest number of must-play cards, which is exactly why Edric is probably the best commander in the game right now. Although I don't, because it's not my preference, because he has the broadest base of OP cards. When I say mandatory, I'm talking OP cards. By being both blue and green, the two colors, and by being a creature-based green. The two situations with the greatest excuse me, number of must-plays. Outside of that, though, red's the weakest, artifacts is the highest, and remember, a lot of those artifacts don't get used if you're playing Edric. And that's why Aloro can kind of keep up. So if you look at my deck choice here, the number of cards that are must-plays, I've got 15 that are in my deck. Excuse me. Another 21 plus Mystical Teachings, which is 22. So 15 and 22 is 37. I've got another 20, which is 57. So 57, and I'm going to run, excuse me, at least 28 lands. Remember, you can go higher, but you don't want to go lower. So 57 and 28 is is 85, which leaves me with 14 cards to play with. I think 14 cards is pretty decent, but I picked these colors because with only 14 cards to play with, um, this color combination feels like one of the most powerful color combinations around because, again, it has these 14 because it has so many cards that are OP and no-brainer inclusions. I think that when you build your decks, if you use these types of lists for whatever color your commander is, if he's green, black, red, then just go to the red color, drop these, put the grudge in, grab these 4 cards, go to their name, grab those cards, and go to the black. Grab these cards here and say, okay, I've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, you get 15 mandatory cards, plus you would get all your artifacts as appropriate, not these two. You get roughly 18 more cards, right? Plus your 15, so there's your 30, 25, 33, plus whatever your 28 land combination is going to be, at a minimum, your 28 at a minimum. So 33, and then 53, 60, 61. So you'd have like, 20, 38 cards that you can play with. So you have more cards that you can play with in the other colors. And because in that particular case you're stacking like lots and lots and lots of artifact removal, you may actually be able to cut some of it down. That's the one thing I did forget to mention. When you combine green and red, then you probably don't use the full package of everything. You probably can take out the Shattering Spree. Leave Vandal Blast because it's a mass hoser. Leave Grudge because it's a 2-for-1. Leave Nature's Claim because it's the most. It's going to kill your target always, and probably take out Natural State. So if you're going to play green and red together, it's Claim, Blast, Grudge. Okay. If you're going to, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, like I said, if you were going to play the example of the color combination I suggest, the green, black, red one, you've got you still got like 30 cards. You can do whatever you want with. I mean, creature base, not creature base. Remember, if you go creature base, adjust the artifacts. Remember, if you go creature base, when we're talking adjust the artifacts, you take out some of the top end ones, but you're playing black, so that means you're going to go with Lotus and Coalition Relic. If you're playing green, also the other card that you leave in if you're playing Necro is you leave in Lantern. Anything that lets you get a Necro into play. So these 3 cards in specific, you leave those in. But if you're going to play green, black, red, then you would probably be playing creatures. So you can take out like this, and you can run elves and stuff. You take out your Dynamo, you take out your Power Stone most likely. You probably take out the Signets and the Talismans, and you put in mana dorks, and then you include the mandatory effects that go when you have creatures, which are the pieces of equipment. You run the Skull Clamp, you run the Jite, you run the 2 swords. So and then you strongly consider and of course the last one being the birthing pod. So hopefully, like, I mean, I've thrown a ton of information at you, but as I have said, I've played since 2009. I have a lot of information built up over the course of 7 years, and it's very difficult to give a crash course on really an in-depth discussion about what makes the most sense in the format without giving context, examples, without drawing the lines. And I know that these conversations will piss some people off because they just tell me, no, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about. And that. All I can say to you is that that's possible, and I will not, if you tell me I'm wrong, I will not say you're wrong. I will not say, no, I'm right. What I'll say is why, and tell me why. And I will listen to what you have to say, because I have been wrong before, I will be wrong again. You may know something I don't know. A lot of people know a lot of stuff, that I don't know. That's no problem. But don't, but please, don't just tell me I'm wrong. Give me no information, because I will ignore you at that point. Because then you just sound like you don't know what you're talking about. I, at least, am backing it up with experience and information. And that's all I ask from anybody. So, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. I hope that it's been interesting. The way that I built this was that I set my quantity to 0 to 20 instead of 1 to 20, which allowed me to, excuse me, display cards that I have 0 copies of. You see all the exclamation marks. There's plenty of cards that, all these cards with the funky things I don't have copies of. So the only deck I actually have, as most of my viewers know, is the Yellow deck. Like I said, the one change I made to it is I took out the excluding deck, put in the mental misstep. But this is, as you've seen, a pretty amazing deck in the sense that it has the highest density of must-play cards of any deck in the format, with the possible exception of Edric. And I say the possible exception because I have not factored in the creature mana and the equipment to figure out exactly how many must-play cards Edric actually has. I've also not. I also have a cards that I'm on the fence about. Dig, Cruise, and actually Karn Liberated and Teferi are cards that I'm on the fence about. I don't know if they fit in the must-play category or not. I do know Factor Fiction is another one, Thirst is another one. But they certainly fit in the very, very good category. Maybe not must-play. So when even the cards that aren't must-play cards are extremely good, it's a good sign. And that's all I got. I look forward to whatever feedback I get for this video. I apologize to those of you who are looking for gameplay, but after hundreds, but so many, over 100 and like what is it, 50 videos of gameplay. I thought it'd be nice to take a break, talk about something else, discuss why the choices are being made in deck construction. And with every single card, every single one, there isn't a land, not a basic land, nothing. There's no card in here that is not thought about and rethought about and practiced with and tested. And even then, even with so many cards that are essentially mandatory, there's always room for innovation and improvement. And that's what makes this game great, along with the collaboration of friends. So, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.